Ever heard of a society that gave newborns a wine bath test to uh, to see if they were strong enough to even live?
Sounds intense.
Well, that was Sparta.
Yeah.
And today we're going deep into their world,
Really?
deeper than those Spartan abs.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about sex and relationships and family in ancient Sparta.
Fascinating stuff.
So, if you think you know Sparta, think again,
Exactly.
because we're using ancient sources like historians and poets
And even philosophers,
to really understand what made this society tick.
particularly when it came to, keeping that warrior culture going.
You might be surprised by how different their views were.
And in some ways similar.
So get ready to challenge your assumptions about ancient Greece.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's start with the basics. Spartan society was built on a pretty rigid structure.
Yeah, it was like a pyramid.
A pyramid.
Yeah, you have the Spartiates at the top, the elite warriors.
Right, the ones we always picture.
Exactly, the ones with all the power shaping the laws and customs. Then below them you have the periokoi.
Okay,
Free, but not citizens, more like skilled artisans and merchants.
gotcha.
The backbone of the economy. And then at the very bottom, the helots.
The largest group.
Yeah, a huge population of enslaved people, descendants of those they conquered.
Right, so they were the workforce.
Kept the whole system running.
So this hierarchy must have really impacted their views on everything, right?
Yeah.
Especially family.
Oh, absolutely. For the Spartiates, staying on top, maintaining that warrior elite, that was everything. It was all about producing strong sons to carry on the legacy.
So basically all about making more warriors.
Exactly, to ensure their military dominance,
Yeah.
everything else, relationships, family life, all secondary.
So then their education system, it was super intense, right? Even for ancient times.
More than intense. It was designed to mold Spartan boys into the perfect warrior. Imagine, at just 7 years old,
7.
they're taken from their families and thrown into the aguge. It's the state-run education system. And we're not talking about reading and writing here. It's all physical and military training, learning obedience, discipline,
Wow.
creating these strong bonds of loyalty and teamwork that were so important in Spartan warfare.
So basically boot camp for 7-year-olds. What about the girls? Did they go through this too?
Not exactly the same, but Spartan girls, they got an education that also really focused on physical fitness. They weren't trained for war like the boys, but they were encouraged to be strong and athletic.
Interesting. Why?
The idea was that strong women would have strong babies, contributing to, the strength of the state.
I see.
Yeah.
So both boys and girls were being prepped for their role.
Right.
But what about love? I mean, were Spartan marriages based on love, or was it all about duty and,
Making babies.
yeah, making those warrior babies?
Well, love might have been there, but let's not get too romantic. Spartan men were expected to marry and do their duty by, producing those babies, preferably sons. There were even incentives for having multiple children. Oh, yeah. Shows how important population growth was for their military. But Spartan marriages, they weren't like the fairy tale kind.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What was a typical Spartan marriage like?
Well, think of it this way. Spartan wives, they had a surprising amount of power.
Really?
Yeah, much more independent than women in other Greek city-states. While their husbands lived in military barracks until they were 30, women were managing households.
Wow.
They were in charge of property, keeping everything running smoothly on the home front.
So that's pretty unusual for that time. But did this power dynamic have any downsides? Did it cause any problems?
That's where it gets interesting. Some scholars believe this power dynamic actually led to a decline in the Spartan population.
Wait, how could giving women more power lead to fewer people?
The theory is that because they had more control, Spartan women maybe chose to have fewer kids than women in other city-states. And this, coupled with the constant losses from warfare, and they did have a major earthquake in 464 BC, it could have really hurt their overall numbers.
Wow, so a seemingly progressive thing might have backfired.
Possibly.
But now let's talk about something really interesting. Their views on sexuality. They had some, well, unconventional ideas about maintaining that strong bloodline.
Oh yeah, they were much more pragmatic than other Greeks about sexuality. For example, they allowed sperm donation outside of marriage.
What?
And it wasn't even considered adultery.
So basically officially sanctioned sperm donation. That's incredibly forward-thinking for ancient Greece. But why? Just to boost the population, or was there more to it?
It was probably both. Keeping a strong citizenry was key for their military, so if a husband couldn't have kids, another man stepping in was a practical solution. But it also speaks to this deep anxiety about keeping the Spartan bloodline pure, which comes up a lot in their culture.
So it wasn't just about numbers, it was about what it meant to be Spartan.
Exactly, preserving that identity. And
Mhm.
we see the same thing with their relationships with the Helots. Relationships between Spartan men and healer women were pretty common, but children from those relationships were almost never full citizens.
So even though they raised those kids, they still had this strong sense of us versus them, like Spartan blood was better.
Right. It shows that even with some progressive elements, those social hierarchies and prejudices were still there. Just goes to show change doesn't happen overnight.
It really makes you rethink ancient Greece. Now, what about those rumors about Spartan women being promiscuous?
Mm.
Was there any truth to them? Or was it just like ancient Greek propaganda?
It seems like most of those rumors came from non-Spartan sources, probably to make them look bad. Don't forget, Sparta was a major power. Not everyone liked them. Spreading gossip was an easy way to attack their reputation.
So basically ancient fake news trying to damage their image.
You got it. While we can't know for sure what went on in private, you have to consider who's spreading those rumors and why.
Good point. It's easy to believe those stories without thinking about who wrote them and why.
Exactly. Especially with Sparta, there are so many myths. It's easy to forget we're talking about real people with real lives in complex societies.
Right, so it's not black and white. Speaking of messy stuff, we have to talk about infanticide. They really valued having kids, but they also got rid of the ones they considered unfit.
Yeah, that's hard to understand from today's perspective. But they were ruthlessly practical when it came to making sure future generations were strong, even if it meant sacrificing their own children.
So what did unfit even mean? What were they looking for?
It seems like they were looking for anything that might mean a child couldn't be a warrior or contribute to the state. Some accounts even say newborns were bathed in wine to check for imperfections.
Wine. Really?
Yeah. And if a baby didn't pass this inspection, it could be left to die.
That's harsh. It shows how different their values were.
It does. It shows they were willing to go to extremes. But now, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about something a little lighter, visual symbols, especially men's facial hair.
Okay, so like Spartan fashion. Were they trendsetters?
Haha. In a way, yes. Spartan men used their facial hair to signal their status, but even more importantly, their obedience to the law. Long hair and beards, that was the norm, like a badge of honor. But here's the interesting part. They shaved their mustaches.
They shaved their mustaches but kept the beards. Why would they do that?
It was all about showing they followed the law. When new officials took office each year, one of the first things they'd say was, shave your mustaches and obey the law.
Wow, so it was like a public display of obedience.
Exactly. A visual reminder that in Sparta, the law was everything. Everyone had to conform.
That's pretty powerful. I bet those shaved mustaches really stood out against those beards.
Oh, yeah, it definitely sent a message. And it gets even more interesting when you think about the fact that Spartan wives usually had short hair. So you have these instant visual cues that separate men and women, highlighting the distinct gender roles.
It's amazing how much meaning they put into facial hair. But let's get back to the women. We talked about their power, but what about their sexuality? Was that viewed differently in Sparta too?
That's where things get complicated. On the one hand, they were expected to have children, especially sons, but there are hints that maybe their sexuality, especially before marriage, was viewed differently than in other parts of Greece.
Okay, you've got my attention. What kind of hints?
Well, remember how we talked about the boys and those relationships they were encouraged to have as part of their training?
Yeah, the inspirer and hearer thing.
Hmm.
Seems very unique to Sparta.
Right. Well, some sources suggest that something similar, though we don't know how common, might have happened with the girls, too.
You're saying there might have been relationships between girls in Sparta? That's a big claim. What's the evidence?
It is a big claim, and to be honest, the evidence is pretty limited. It's mostly based on comparing it to the boys' education. The thinking is that if the boys were encouraged to have these relationships, maybe the girls were too.
Interesting theory. But is there anything more concrete, or is it mostly speculation?
Well, there's the poetry of Alcman, a Spartan poet. He wrote these maiden songs performed by young girls. And some of the language is pretty suggestive, with a lot of focus on beauty and attraction.
So maybe a little bit of girl crush vibes going on?
Maybe. But we have to remember these were poems, not diaries. The suggestive language might have just been for entertainment, not a literal description of what they did.
Makes sense. It's like trying to figure out a secret code. We can guess, but we can't be sure what it really meant.
Exactly. We have to be careful not to project our own modern ideas onto these ancient texts. We can analyze, explore, but we have to admit we don't know everything.
True. It makes you think about how these Spartan views on sexuality would be seen today. We live in a world where any hint of impropriety is a scandal, but the Spartans were seemingly fine with things like sperm donation outside of marriage.
Yeah, it's a huge contrast. But remember, their values and priorities were completely different. For Spartans, the most important thing was continuing their warrior way of life. Everything else, even sex, was secondary to that goal.
It really makes you wonder how their approach to sexuality affected their society. Was it good or bad? Did it help them or hurt them in the long run? It's a complicated question.
It is, and it's one that historians are still debating. There's no simple answer. There are so many factors that contributed to the rise and fall of Sparta, and that's what makes studying them so fascinating. It's a constant exploration and reevaluation.
Learning about this other side of Sparta has definitely changed my perspective. They were surprisingly progressive in some ways.
Right. It shows that even the most militaristic societies can be complex and full of contradictions. People are complicated, and history is rarely straightforward.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to take a quick break. But when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into these complexities, exploring the lives of Spartan women and the myths and realities surrounding their sexuality. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into ancient Sparta. Before the break, we were talking about Spartan women and their sexuality. It's a topic wrapped up in history and those rumors that have stuck around for centuries. Yeah, those juicy rumors. But before we get too lost in speculation, let's talk about the most famous Spartan woman, Helen of Troy. You can't talk about Spartan women and sexuality without mentioning the woman who supposedly started a war. Was she really as seductive and influential as the myths make her out to be?
Helen. Her story is a perfect example of how history and myth get all tangled up, especially when it comes to powerful women. Was she really a seductress who ran off with Paris, or was she more like a pawn in a bigger political game?
Yeah, a symbol used to justify going to war.
Exactly. The truth is probably somewhere in between.
It's like trying to untie a really old knot. So many different versions, but we'll never really know what happened. But even if we don't take those stories literally, can we learn anything about how Spartan women were seen both by their own people and by outsiders?
Definitely. Even if we take away the myths and the exaggerations, Helen's story still tells us something about the anxieties and fantasies people had about women and power and sexuality in ancient Greece. Her abductions suggest that Spartan women, even the high-status ones, were seen as vulnerable to men.
So it plays into that idea that
Yeah.
women were possessions to be won or stolen, not people with their own desires.
Exactly. And it ties into those rumors about Spartan women being promiscuous. Maybe those rumors, spread by their rivals, were a reaction to the power and independence Spartan women had. It was a way to try to control their image.
So like ancient victim blaming. Nothing new there, I guess.
Sadly, no. But it's also important to remember that Spartan women weren't just sitting back and taking it. They pushed back against these stereotypes.
Really?
Well, there's this story told by Herodotus about a young Spartan girl who wasn't considered very pretty.
Okay.
Her mother was worried about her future.
Yeah, makes sense. Beauty standards were a thing back then, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So the mother took her daughter to a shrine dedicated to Helen and Menelaus, hoping for a miracle.
So basically, they were asking for a divine beauty makeover.
Pretty much. And according to Herodotus, it worked. The girl became absolutely stunning, so beautiful that she caught the eye of a Spartan king who wanted to marry her.
Talk about a glow up. But what does this tell us about Spartan women and how they thought about beauty? Was it just about looks or something more?
It tells us that beauty was important in Sparta, like in most ancient cultures. But I think it also shows how far Spartan mothers would go to make sure their daughters had a good future. It wasn't just about superficial beauty, it was about making sure their daughters had a good marriage and a secure life.
It reminds us that these women weren't just bystanders. They had a hand in shaping their own lives and their children's lives. They had goals and strategies, and they used whatever they could, whether it was prayer or clever matchmaking, to get what they wanted.
Exactly. They understood the rules and they used them to their advantage.
So Helen of Troy might be more myth than reality. But the girl who prayed for beauty gives us a more realistic glimpse into the lives of real Spartan women. They were complex individuals trying to make their way in a complex society. But let's get back to marriage in Sparta. You said Spartan marriages weren't really about love, so what were they about?
Well, remember, the main purpose of marriage for the state was to have babies, especially future Spartan warriors. It was about maintaining their military power.
Right. Those warrior babies were priority number one.
Yeah.
But how did they actually find a partner? Was it arranged marriages, or did they have any choice?
It seems like marriages were usually arranged like in a lot of ancient cultures, but even something as traditional as marriage had some unusual twists in Sparta.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of twists?
Imagine this. The bride is dressed up like a man with short hair, and the groom is supposed to kidnap her, even though it's all planned out beforehand, and the first night. It doesn't happen in some romantic place. It happens in a rough place, like a cellar.
A cellar. It's not very romantic. It seems so strange considering how much they cared about strength and beauty. What was the point of all that?
It is strange, and there are a lot of theories about why they had these rituals. Some people think it was a way for the groom to show his dominance, to symbolically conquer his bride as part of their warrior culture.
So like a ritual to establish who's in charge. Seems kind of harsh on the bride.
It does, and it reinforces the idea that Spartan men were all about strength and control. But here's the weird part. Once that ritual was over, Spartan wives had a lot of power and responsibility.
Right. So it starts with this show of male dominance, and then the woman becomes the one in charge at home. That's very different from the typical image of women in ancient societies.
Exactly. It's one of the things that makes Sparta so fascinating. They didn't follow the usual rules about gender roles. They were unique.
And that uniqueness had its consequences. But before we go there, I want to talk more about the Helot women. We talked about relationships between Spartan men and Helot women, but what were those relationships really like?
It's an important part of the story. It shows the power imbalances in Spartan society. Remember, the Helots were the enslaved people. They had no power. They were basically the ones keeping the Spartan economy running.
So there was an imbalance of power not just between men and women, but between Spartans and Helots.
Exactly. And it's hard to imagine those relationships being anything but exploitative.
It's true. While some relationships might have had genuine feelings, you can't ignore the fact that these women had no choice.
Absolutely. They couldn't freely consent in a system that took away their basic rights.
It's a tough part of Spartan history to face. It's easy to get caught up in the image of the warriors and the strong women, but we can't forget the injustice that was part of their system.
You're right. Even societies that seem admirable in some ways can be built on really bad things. It reminds us to look deeper and to question the systems that shape our world.
It makes you wonder if those contradictions, those differences between their ideals and reality, caused their downfall, like a crack that weakens the whole building over time.
It's definitely possible. But before we decide, let's look at the specific challenges Sparta faced. Remember we talked about their population decline? That was a big problem for them.
Yeah, it seemed like they were running out of people, even when they were powerful.
Hmm.
How did they deal with that? Did they try to change, or did they stick with their traditions?
That's where things get even more interesting. Because the Spartans, despite their rigid structure and their traditions, were actually willing to adapt.
So they weren't just stuck in the past.
There's evidence they tried different things to stay on top. For example, they started using more non-Spartiate soldiers, including men with Spartan fathers and Helot mothers, to fill in the gaps in their army.
You mean the Multhags. They weren't full citizens, but they became more important as the number of true Spartans went down.
Exactly. It was a practical solution. But it also caused problems. Not everyone liked seeing these traditionally lower status groups gaining power.
So a clash between tradition and the need to change. They had to adapt to survive, but change threatened their whole identity.
You got it. And it's something we see throughout history. Societies have to choose between holding on to the past or changing to survive, even if it means changing their core values. It's a hard choice.
And it seems like for Sparta, those internal struggles plus the pressure from other city-states was too much. They were fighting on too many fronts. But before we finish, let's go back to those stories about Spartan women from outsiders. Were they true or just rumors? It's hard to know what to believe when it comes to ancient gossip.
It's hard to separate truth from exaggeration. Remember, Sparta was powerful and had a lot of enemies. They wanted to make Sparta look bad. Think of it like ancient smear campaigns.
Ancient fake news.
Pretty much. Don't forget, these stories were often written by people who weren't Spartan and wanted to portray them negatively, whether it was because of politics, cultural differences, or just wanting to tell a scandalous story. We have to be careful about taking these sources at face value.
Right, like those stories about Spartan fathers offering their daughters to visitors. That sounds too crazy to be true, even for Spartans.
Exactly. Those were probably just meant to shock people to make the Spartans look bad.
It's a classic tactic. Make your enemies seem like monsters to justify attacking them.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history is often written by the winners, the people in power. We can't just accept what they say without thinking critically, especially when it reinforces negative stereotypes.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle when some of the pieces are missing. We can see the general picture, but we also have to admit there are things we'll never know for sure.
Absolutely. But even with the missing pieces, we can still learn a lot about this fascinating and complex society.
Trying to figure out what was real and what was fake about Spartan women is tough. We get these little hints about their lives, but there are so many questions about who they really were and what they believed. It makes you wonder what they'd think about all this. Did they like that warrior culture, or did they want something different, something more peaceful? I guess we'll never really know.
That's the thing about history, isn't it? It's fascinating, but also frustrating. We can look at the evidence, think about different sides, but we'll never truly know what people were thinking hundreds of years ago, especially women. Their voices are often missing from history. What we know about Spartan women mostly comes from men, so it's all filtered through their point of view.
It's like trying to listen to a song, but only half the instruments are playing. You can hear the main tune, but you're missing the parts that make it really rich and interesting. But I think we've learned some pretty cool stuff about Spartan women. They were much more than those simple stereotypes.
Oh, definitely. They were daughters, wives, mothers, but they were also property owners, businesswomen, even leaders in their communities. They had to balance their duties with their own ambitions, all in this culture that was obsessed with strength and war. It's amazing how resilient and adaptable they were.
But what about the system itself? Their laws and customs were so important to them. Did they ever try to change them, or were they totally stuck in their ways?
That's where Lycurgus comes in. He was this legendary lawgiver, kind of a mythical figure, the one who created Sparta's unique system, the one that shaped their whole worldview. He's like their founding father.
So their whole society was built on the laws of this almost mythical guy. Did they ever question those laws, or was his word like the ultimate truth?
They definitely respected Lycurgus, but they weren't always bound by his every word. They understood that things change and you have to adapt to stay relevant. They made changes over time as they needed to. They weren't just blindly following old rules.
So it's more like a set of guidelines, not strict rules. They could interpret them based on what was happening around them.
Right. They knew that societies are always changing. They have to change to survive. And that's what makes studying them so interesting. It challenges what we think we know about the past. We tend to think of ancient societies as unchanging, but they were actually much more dynamic than that.
They weren't just following a script. They were making decisions, dealing with problems, trying to make things work, just like we do today.
Exactly. And by looking at those choices, their successes and their failures, we can learn about ourselves, about how societies work, about the constant struggle between tradition and progress. It's a story that still matters today.
It's like they're holding up a mirror to us. We see our own problems in their story, wanting to hold on to power, arguing about values, needing to change to survive. It reminds us that we're all part of this human story, figuring out how to build a good society.
That's the power of history. It's not just about dates and wars. It's about understanding people, the choices we make, what happens because of those choices. It's about connecting with the past, seeing ourselves in it, and learning from both the good and the bad.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our Spartan adventure. We've talked about their sexuality, their marriages, the tensions in their society, and the challenges they faced as they changed and eventually disappeared. It's been a fascinating trip, full of surprises.
We've seen how their focus on military strength affected every part of their lives, from how they raised their kids to how they thought about family. We've also seen them trying to change, to adapt, which shows they were dealing with the complexities of their own world.
And we've met the incredible women of Sparta who had power and influence in ways that we don't usually associate with ancient Greece. They were more than just wives and mothers. They were shaping their own lives and the future of their society.
It's a story that keeps us thinking, reminding us that even the most famous civilizations are just made up of people, with all their complicated and contradictory behavior. And that history is made up of so many individual stories, all woven together.
So thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive into ancient Sparta. We hope you enjoyed it.
And if you want to learn more, we have a list of books and resources on our website. Check it out.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more fascinating explorations of history, culture, and everything in between. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.